What we've done in medicine up to now is we have divided you up into all of these different specialties, right? So if you've got a rash, we send you to the dermatologist. And if you have something wrong with your gut, you see the gastroenterologist. But what's probably happening underneath that is some underlying inflammation that is causing the rash and the gut problem. And what I think the medicine of the future is bringing it all together and looking at you as a holistic piece.
What happens when a world-class scientist deeply embedded in the rigors of molecular biology and immunology realizes the very medical system she joined lacks the tools to heal her patients? Dr. Helen Messier began her journey in the lab, decoding the central hub of cellular information, only to face a staggering translation gap in the clinic. A 17-year delay between life-saving research and patient care. Refusing to accept a future of merely managing chronic disease, she took a leap of faith and moved science upstream. Today, she is pioneering that upstream medicine, transforming the black box of human biology into a transparent map for healing. Join us as we explore Helen's transformation from researcher to healer and discover how you can reclaim agency over your own biological story. Dr. Helen Messier is a physician scientist at the forefront of precision and longevity medicine, bridging molecular biology, clinical care, and systems innovation. With a foundation in genetics, a PhD in molecular immunology, and an MD in family medicine, her career has been defined by one driving question: how do we move science upstream before disease begins? From founding concierge medical practices to leading genomics strategy at Human Longevity Inc., serving as CMO at BioScope and Fountain Life, and now recently moving into the same role at BioScope.ai, Dr. Messier has consistently translated complex biological data into actionable human-centered care. Dr. Messier, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and you have, quite a journey to share, fellow Canadian, I'll point out at the beginning. And one of the things that, really captured me in our first conversation is you had, from what I understand, is an established and thriving career as an MD in family medicine, but were somehow called to do more. And that included, molecular biology, PhD in molecular biology, and setting up a number of, I think, multi-omics shops in Canada and others before you got recruited to do this kind of at a, continental level. So really interested to, if you could share to the extent that you'd like, the origins, like what called you into medicine, and then, at what point did you realize that you weren't done? And well, let's see where we get to. And then, of course, I want to learn about BioScope.ai. I mean, your reputation precedes you, Dawn recommending you as my guest. So shout out to Don if he's listening. And but yeah, so let's talk about you. How did we get to where we are?
Wow. Okay. The story gets longer every year.
Right. That's a good thing.
It's a good thing. That's what it's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, sure.
It really, I started out life actually as a scientist. So, went into undergrad ultimately in biology, and then chose genetics as a field to focus on. And I chose genetics because it's the central hub of the information of the entire cell in the body lives within the genetics. So I thought that was the control hub. So I wanted to focus on where the action was. And so did genetics, went on to do a PhD in molecular immunology. So really focusing on that molecular biology genetics component into the immunology world and, self from non-self. And when you get into immunology, you start to realize that this is very applicable to human health. And so really I got to that point where I had graduated, I'd done a postdoc, and that's what actually got me down to the States in the first place is finishing my research down in San Diego in La Jolla, and having the wonderful honor of working with some amazing scientists and real legends in the immunology field. And then going, now what? Do I want to kind of spend the rest of my career writing for grants, never knowing where funding's coming from? The research world I admire everyone who does it. I love it, but it's a hard slog. And so I remember sitting with two friends of mine. One was a postdoc in the lab with me, and the other was a physician. And I sat them both down. They were a couple. And I said, if you had to choose, what would you do? And they both said, go into medicine. And the reason was, the rewards in a research kind of career are when they come, when you make that discovery, when you publish that paper, it's amazing, right? Wonderful. But those are few and far between, right? You work really hard to get to those points. Whereas the physician said, every day, all it takes is a patient looking at you and saying, thank you, doctor, and your day is made. And so I thought, okay, let me see how I can actually take all of this amazing knowledge that I have and learned in the scientific world and really actually apply that to people so that they can benefit. So, and went into medicine and actually chose primary care because I didn't want to focus on down the rabbit hole. I wanted to look at the whole person. And so that's why I went into family medicine and primary care. And what I realized very quickly when I got out into practice was 80+% of the people I was seeing had some kind of chronic disease. And I realized that the tools that I had learned in med school were not actually even close to enough to address this epidemic of chronic disease. I wanted to reverse it. I wanted to prevent it. But what we were doing was managing it, right? They were managing chronic disease. We're controlling symptoms, but we're not actually really addressing the underlying things that are causing these diseases to progress. So, and then you start seeing some of these hard diseases where we don't even have symptom control, very, very much symptom control of fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, these diseases where you look at your schedule and you're like, oh, I don't want to see this person because I don't have anything to offer them. So being a scientist, I went back to the literature. That's what you do. And you start reading and you start realizing that there is a huge amount of information that they never taught me in med school. And I was, wow, things as basic now, it seems basic now, but at the time, someone with irritable bowel syndrome, I started reading about the microbiome. Oh, microbiome is actually important in someone's health. And so these types of things have been written in the literature and talked about in the scientific world for a long time, yet the application into the clinical world took, and still does, to be fair, 15 to 20 years. That's that whole idea of the translational gap. And so I, kind of started rediscovering the wheel to some degree. And like, how do I apply these findings in the literature to that patient that's sitting in front of me? And so that really got me, focused on this idea. I call it upstream medicine. And so the same principles, if you can address the underlying drivers or causes of disease, not only can you reverse them, but you can use the same thing to prevent them, right? Both, it's the same principles that apply to both. And so, so I started doing that and seeing some pretty amazing results. It got me learning about I'm not the only one thinking this way. There's a whole group of physicians in the functional medicine world really that are looking at that underlying cause. So, and then it became, you start developing a reputation that you're the doctor to go to when you have a problem. So started, really getting, I would say, harder and harder, complex chronic disease and needing a better toolkit. So, these are the patients where, again, I'll use the example of something like a chronic fatigue where you can measure every current biomarker, the common ones that we measure in medicine, and they all come back normal. Yet that person can't get out of bed. So there's obviously something going on that we're not able to identify with our current toolbox or toolkit. So, I started going, we need a better toolkit. And that's what got me doing genomics. And, I understand genetics from the research side, but hey, well, now we can actually sequence the human genome. And I paid $10,000 to sequence my genome, right? And, that's a better toolkit. Now our understanding is lagged behind that, but then metabolomics and proteomics, wow, these are bigger toolkits that I can start to use. And lo and behold, you start to see things that might explain what's going on in that patient. So it just became this wonderful learning journey. And then the challenge became, okay, now how do you actually apply this or practice this kind of medicine, because it does not fit in the current medical models of how we deliver care, where fee for service, you have to see, in Canada at the time, I think we got paid $30 a visit as a physician. That doesn't really lend itself to spending an hour with the patient and then doing research and capturing these complex data sets that take days to wade through. So it became, the necessity to what's a different model that we can deliver care and real care, real good medicine. And that's what got me doing the concierge medical practices as a way to be able to practice really good medicine. So that's kind of what started my whole journey in this space.
Amazing. So I got the order wrong. So you did your PhD first and then you did medicine.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell me if this resonates. I remember when I got to the end of grad school, going to my PhD supervisor and being like, I don't think I'm ready to graduate. And he's like, what do you mean? I was like, well, now I know more of what I don't know. Right? It's like you come in and you're like, hey, I'm going to do this like really cool project. And mine was actually quite meta. Like literally it was the using metagenomics. So that's like tools to sequence DNA directly from the environment. Mm-hmm. I was looking at the molecular ecology of a mobile gene pool, like these genes that are hyper transferred and think of the clinical setting, think of the gut microbiome. That's going to be these adaptive or evasive genes, drug resistance.
All the time in our gut ecosystem. Absolutely.
Exactly. And yeah, like this was the beginning. This was right around the time that the human genome was being sequenced. And, you kind of, gosh, I mean, even last week, I think the what is it? Alpha genome, the deep research tool from Google, like this work that they've done that now is you're able to look at like 1 megabase pair reads for context of like different splice junction sites. And so looking at long read sequencing, we can see a lot more in terms of differential splicing and regulation. And it's like, oh gosh, like I really don't know what's going on. But so anyway, my point was, but I think, so when I said that to Ford, who's my supervisor, he said, well, that's how I know that you know. Or that's how I know that you're ready, because you're never going to stop learning and like, don't ever lose that. Right. So, and that's why I think they call it research, right? You got to research and this notion of complex disease that you point to as well. And that's kind of this emergent phenomenon now where it's much more feasible that like the N of 1, right? And, being able, and I'd love to spend some time on that certainly. And, I would echo your sentiment about the knowledge translation gap. I mean, in particular with the microbiome. So that was some of my early research in my postdoc. Actually, with Ruth Lay, we did the first colonization of the infant gut microbiome. It was like a 2.5 year.
Wow.
Yeah, of just one infant. But you got the depth of, well, I mean, just kind of natural, spontaneous perturbations that come with being, 0 to 2.5. And so that would include, the breast milk profile, like the meconium, based on, how that, basically co-develops with the infant in the environment. There's, when the infant got sick, ear infection, here's what happens when, you have the antibiotic. Here's what happens when you introduce a solid food or cow's milk. Here's what happens after a vaccination. And they're all things that you can't really say with any certainty that they are, causative. It's just, hey, here's a relationship. And I remember actually I had actually Sean Gibbons, who's over at ISB, on as one of my guests, and he's turning these into like microbiome models into like actual predictable, I don't know if you call it therapeutics, but basically he can look at a digital twin of your gut and give you a best case scenario for a diet type to control the IBS or to correct the IBS based on your gut profile and your short chain fatty acid analysis. So, but it was about 17 years. I said, wow, that's okay. It's exciting to see that knowledge translation. I was like, that's a long time. And he's like, 17 years. Yeah, that's about the 15-year gap, right?
Yeah.
But so then that takes us to like the better toolkit, right? Like in what you've said about not only now in the clinic, is there a better toolkit to take these complex treat conditions, let's say.
Yeah.
One that I think is an interesting one. More recently, I did some work with Dysautonomia International, which is that's a really interesting one because that's a whole community that has been, their words, kind of gaslit or not heard because the constraints of the system, right, is like pay for service. So now here we are, this interesting paradigm, which I think you said it without saying it, is it's more of a going from a fee for service learning model or medical model constraint, and instead for like to like a fee for outcome. So I want to get your sense of like the difference between concierge medicine and then you called it not internal, you called it family medicine or
in primary care.
Primary care, sorry, yeah. And like, I wonder if, like, so I think there's, so if I get an infection or I break a leg or, there's urgent, like there's, I think one form of, treatment. And then if I want to be preventative and proactive and upstream, that's something else. So I want to hear like a little bit about like, obviously how you perceive the differences, but are we getting into like kind of a bifurcation of like what these things even are? Like, whereas one is, and I guess what I'm getting to is wellness and like not yoga or breath work, which is fine. I mean like scientific wellness, like Lee Hood talks about, right? Mm-hmm. And is there a time to kind of separate medicine from this? So I'm not landing the words quite tightly here. Maybe I'm being deliberately vague because I want to lean on the fact that you've been in both worlds. Mm-hmm. Is there a dichotomy, or all of these things? Is there an event where these things are going to be more about a confluence? What's your sense based on where you've come from, where you are?
I think so. Kind of the wellness, scientific wellness. I just want to make sure I understand your question. So acute medicine, primary care versus preventative medicine. Kind of bringing that all in. I think we need to, and I think we're going in that direction already, to bring it all together. We cannot separate it. Just like, what we've done in medicine up to now is we have divided you up into all of these different specialties, right? So if you've got a rash, we send you to the dermatologist. And if you have something wrong with your gut, you see the gastroenterologist. But what's probably happening underneath that is some underlying inflammation that is causing the rash and the gut problem. So we can't separate that. And what I think the medicine of the future is bringing it all together and looking at you as a holistic piece. Like the same thing with, your brain is not separate from your body. We've often separated mental health from physical health. They're not separate. We know now with the microbiome, the gut-brain axis, we know how important the microbiome is in your overall mental health. And we know that how important it is in every other part of your body. So what that's illustrating is that everything is connected, right? You talked about ISB. We're systems biology. We are everything is interconnected to everything else. And including, I mentioned mental health, but including the whole idea of body-mind connection, right? The idea that what you think, your emotions, actually have a physical effect. And so, in my experience as a physician dealing with a lot of, chronic disease over my career, I see always there's an underlying emotional component. We can call it stress, we can call it other things, but that's a really important component as well that we often try to separate from the physical health, and we can't. And so I remember this was back during my PhD, we had a speaker come, and he was talking about psychoneuroimmunology, right? And I thought, whoa, right? This is, the thoughts that you think affect your immune system, they affect your nervous system. The nervous system and the immune system share receptors. All of these things we're starting to understand from a scientific perspective, the basis for that, understanding, I think, that humans have had for a long time, how important that is. We understand how trauma affects health in the long run, how adverse childhood events and trauma can actually impact your epigenetics and, your gene expression, and how your disease may manifest in the future. And you can carry that back a generation or more, how we now can transfer on effects of lifestyle and stress to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, right? So it's just it's such a wonderful time to be alive right now, seeing this all come together. And so this idea of the reductionist approach that we do it in science and we do it in medicine, that you can only study one thing alone, you can only make one intervention alone, that will never answer the bigger questions of how we create optimal health and wellness for everybody. So I think we're now at a time where we can start to answer a lot of these questions. The tools that we have are much more accessible to people, like I think I paid $10,000 for a genome, and you now get it for $200, right? To get your whole genome done. You can now get a lot of these multi-omic analyses with really cost effectiveness. That creates a lot of data. So that obviously segues into, what I'm doing now at BioScope, but how do we start making sense of these big, enormous data sets that are much cheaper to get, the wearable data, all of that, we can start to get insights on your stress, on your sleep, and how that interacts with the other biological things that we are measuring. But these are such big data sets that it's only with the machine, the AI, that we're starting to be able to make this accessible to more and more people and start to understand it. So again, another exciting time, like all of this confluence of multi-omics, of our understanding that everything is connected from a systems biology perspective, our ability to analyze it with AI is huge right now. It's all coming together. And I think that's going to, again, really reinforce the fact that everything's connected, because it's patterns. It's never one thing. And we're going to be able to utilize that to really democratize and make this accessible to everybody.
Amazing. I want to get into the BioScope platform, because I've been playing around with it. Make sure I want to get this right. I was connecting with, what's Dawn's son's name?
Chris.
I connected with him last week, and he walked me through. Yeah, it was, Chris Brown. Okay. That was a delightful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of want to echo some things back, because I think it'll set up where we're going nicely. This notion of the whole human as the system. So I want to come to that in a second, but I love what you're, pointing to. What was the phrase? It wasn't psychosomatic, or was a version of that. It was psychoimmune. What was it?
Neuroimmunology. Yeah.
Neuroimmunology. And then this idea of, childhood trauma, intergenerational traumas. We know those things to be true, right? Like by these kind of larger population studies, like the Dutch hunger famine, for example.
Right.
So we know there's a specific methylation profile associated with an increased predisposition for, paranoid schizophrenia and obesity. Because, it would make sense to be hyper alert if someone's trying to kill you, and to store your food for later if you don't know where it's going to come from. So it's, right. On the one hand, it's just completely fascinating that we can, as humans, be like kind of tuned, like as we're developing. But then you've got this kind of catch-22 now, where the environment is changing so quickly, comparatively, say, compared to even 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm talking about is, the stress now that we are, adapted to. So, and it might not be a, crouching tiger, hidden dragon, or drought or famine. But what of social media, for example? What of social isolation for 2 years? Right? And those are kind of still population level, but then you have kind of more discrete, localized stressors, whether that be like an immigration community, and then even further isolated or reduced, let's say, to the individual family unit. And so, I mean, I imagine a day where the epigenetics will be, kind of a part of that, signal and patterning. And, there's already in the, call it the clinical psychology realm, speaking to this, like in particular, came across this in, what is it called? Into internal family systems. So this idea, right? Yeah. So of like,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting just to have that language as a way to contemplate, right? Right. Like, because before it's all in your head, right? And, I'm not asking for free consult here, but I'll just give you the context is, my father would have emigrated to the UK during World War II because of, Nazi occupation and to Canada. And, my mother navigated her own trauma during kind of a fractured, family. And there were downstream effects of chronic disease that would have manifested in something like, MS on my mom's side, and probably more like Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes on my dad's side, more to do with like addictive and protective behaviors by, I think systems that they would have put in place for their survival.
Yeah.
But now the environment like changes, and it's like this kind of like iterative loop. Okay, well, that stress is no longer there. And so what worked before, it's like, great, you have that capability, but now you want to talk about tools. It's like, but that tool is hurting you now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So being able to have like that lens as part of, so the psychology is part of the biology. And so this is what so again, being privileged to have gone and being able to think about DNA for 25 years, let's say, is I get to build my own kind of LLM for myself and for my daughter and for my wife. And you can see things like my daughter, like genetically, it's like, no, she's not throwing tantrums or she's not being difficult at bedtime. It's like she has this kind of overactive histamine intolerance to specific foods. And so that's changed the bedtime protocol. And, there's intergenerational legacy trauma, let's say, of even on my wife's side, like her father immigrating from the Ukraine, and then both of them kind of military brats. So like really heightened cognition in general. And I see that with my daughter. It's like, wow, she doesn't need much to get real sick. And she's only 2.25. So I'm definitely over indexing. As a dad, I'm probably reading too much into it. But that's the point that I wanted to get to, is like, okay, I'm organizing all of this stuff. And this comes back to you, is like, well, how do we do both? It's like, I can do a good job of stewarding the data, but now how do I work in partnership and collaboration with my care team? And the fact is right now is I can't, because not everybody's like you, Dr. Messier. You went back but I think hopefully what you're doing is kind of trailblazing it so that it could be, well, I think that everybody wants to. So anyway, what I'm trying to get to is the systems approach that you've identified here as these emergent properties don't need to be like, oh, wow, that is random or a miracle. It's like, no, like if we understand how all the different subsystems that come together, we can have emergent properties that are bad and reduce those, but understand everybody's kind of path to the reduction, not by a reductionist model. It's by a systems model. And okay, so the question is, like, how is the outlook in BioScope? Like how does that become collaborative? And I know you're just getting started there, so would love to understand why you went there and what's so hopeful about that platform.
Yeah. So Fantastic. And we can dive really deep into this whole concept.
Oh man, yeah.
I think the trajectory of my career has been one of, wow, first discovery, like, wow, this actually works, number one. And when I'm working individually with patients, I'm still surprised a lot of times that, wow, when we do some simple interventions of lifestyle and focus on their microbiome and other things, they actually get better and you can reverse autoimmune disease and all these things. So first was that discovery that this works, understanding the toolkit, applying it, and then going, everybody needs access to this, right?
Mhm.
It's not, I realize, look, I'm being one person, I can only see so many patients, one patient at a time. Wonderful. I learned, it's great. But even wading through these complex data sets, like I would spend a day just going through one person's data. And that's not a scalable way to get this to more people. So the next step was, why don't I teach other physicians, right? That way, if we teach other physicians to do it, we can scale this much, much broader. And that's what, got me with setting up the concierge practice, is teaching other physicians. And then I had the opportunity to work at Human Longevity, which is, again, thinking, okay, now this is a business model where we can scale even bigger, getting the names like Craig Venter leading this, and how do we just get this to much more and more people? So my entire kind of career has been one of, how do we start to make this more accessible? And I think that ultimately that's why I joined BioScope, is that this is how we're going to make this accessible to more everybody, and at the same time generate continually new insights, generate that connecting it all together. So being able to bring in BioScope is a platform, BioScope.ai, it's a platform for physicians to use, that ingests the multi-omics data, starting with our genome, and we're adding more and more of the omics, along with everything else that you would collect from your medical record, for all of your basic lab work, and extensive understanding of who that person is from a stress perspective, from using things like wearables with HRV to measure that, but being able to bring that all together and present it to the physician in a way that they can now take advantage of all that information and a lot of new insights, hypothesis generation on what's going on with their patients, and apply that. So it's really this idea of building the platform of medicine that is going to make democratize the ability to do this. It's I wanted to just comment a little bit on this whole adaptation idea, right? It's a really interesting time for humans, because we're what you said very nicely is that if our genes, our physiology is there to protect us, and we adapt to different situations to keep us alive, essentially. And so, another good example of that is, why do we have so much obesity now? Why do we have? It's because the people that become obese in our current climate are the ones that would have survived the famines of the past, right? So they're the ones that developed the genetic and physiological tools that when there was no food, they could store food when they had it, and they could store it as fat, which allowed them to survive famine. Now that's what has been passed down. Now you take those same genetics and you put them in an environment where there's unlimited food, where there is no fasting, and that same adaptation now becomes maladaptive, and it leads to obesity. So it's really important to look at human kind of genetics, physiology in that context, right? The body's not being stupid. The body is reacting to things that it's been trained to do to protect you. And so, now that that our environment is changing so rapidly, we're living a toxic world, and toxic in many ways, from environmental toxins and these forever chemicals, these PFASs and the microplastics that everyone's talking about, and in addition to, electromagnetic frequencies. And then the stress is toxic too, right? So social media, you mentioned, we live in an age of non-ending stimulation. And we're not giving our nervous system a chance to actually recover. So that results in a lot of chronic disease. And it's not that the body is being stupid. The body is trying to protect and react in a way that over time is maladaptive in an environment that it's not kind of meant to be in. So I think those are things we need to always think about. And, I'm hoping that as we collect the data, through our BioScope platform, we're going to be understanding so much more. Like, how can two people with similar genetic variants, but living in different locations, have a completely different response to something? It might be because this place they're living in high air pollution and this one's not, right? And so you can come up with like millions of these hypotheses and complex questions, and it's going to take a lot of data to figure them out. And we now, which is so exciting, I think, are at a time where we can start to do that. And we can start to collect this information. And ultimately, the whole purpose of systems biology, of all of this, is to deal with, or to be able to do very personalized N of one care that's both predictive, as Lee Hood says, the 4P medicine, right? Preventive, predictive, proactive. We're able to now do that and be able to predict what's going to work for that individual. Humans are generally the same, but we're still different as well. We have this biochemical genetic uniqueness that not the same thing's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah, I think we might have talked about this on our last. You mentioned this idea of stress, right? And the work that I'd done with athletes previously, in particular, there's a track and field organization called Altus, and when I worked with them, essentially this was about 10 years ago, bringing them like DNA insights to, essentially complement their, very sophisticated, high touch coaches program. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting, well, a lot of things that were interesting about their DNA, and one of them was the kind of the openness to which that they, shared their content. And one of the things that really struck me, my background is as a track and field athlete. You might say that I stayed in academia as long as I did so that I could be a pseudo professional athlete, because I was a track and field athlete. So I was always, thinking about, not only how do I use this information to just, better understand life and biology, but actually how do I use it in, and for health, but also for performance. And what I learned from Altus is this notion of, there's the acute stress, and and then there's the chronic stress. So the acute stress might be, and then there's that's called the optimized stress. Mm-hmm. And so if you do too much acute stress, you're gonna break pretty quickly. If you do prolonged chronic stress, you're gonna break down over time and you're gonna burn out. They're both maladaptive. The chronic, and that's actually essentially what the optimal ratio is how do we find the acute to chronic load ratio? Mm-hmm. And what we discovered in working with them was, the unit in and of itself is its own thing. Like it's basically a ratio, a sliding window ratio of the athlete's self-reported, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard was my training? And there were other factors that you could put in there. It was called a Hooper-McKinnon survey developed by a physiologist. This was before wearables, I should say. So it was, you're measuring rate of perceived exertion. So it's all on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard was your training? How long was it? And so you've got the intensity, the duration, you've got the density. So how often are you stressing that athlete? And then there are other measures that went alongside with that, like how sore are you? What's your mood? What's your motivation? Mm-hmm. And what was really neat to look at that longitudinally over the course of it was a year or so as they were training up to the Olympic Games, and then to actually, look at the athlete's tendency to report, and also were there any underlying, genetics that we could infer based on the athlete's reporting that might be the root cause of why the athlete reports a certain way over and over again, both positively and negatively. And the really interesting thing that I saw looking at the Olympic athletes is like, coming back to what we were talking about, is the adaptive nature of, humans, our biology, and looking at it at a systems level is for all intents and purposes that for maybe 8, maybe 12, if you're, an outlier, year window as an athlete, but let's, 4, like that is a lifetime for that athlete insofar as what they're trying to achieve with their biology. And how they define longevity, like how Tom Brady would define longevity, is obviously very different while he was up to age, say, 44, 45, when he was competing, which is an impressively long time for NFL, obviously. But like now his goal is going to be changing in terms of like what KPIs he's looking at in his biology, what markers. So there's a couple of things here. Is like, one is the athlete model is really neat insofar as you can see the consequences of inflammation, insofar as measured by like 100th of a second in, say, the sprints, or 10ths of a second, right? So you can actually, because with track and field, by the way, it's what's nice is you're measuring, how fast, and it's each individual. And so to look at that athlete as a system, what I realize is the perfect program isn't written until the athlete stands on the podium. And then you look back and say that's the perfect program, but it's always in hindsight. But the real, let's say, lessons for Olympians that I was able to kind of draw from this very immersive experience is not that we want to kind of impose a system. Triathlon does this really well, right? Is like, because more and more the endurance sports do this, and insofar as the volume and like what discipline are we doing, the bike, the run, or the swim, and those are all things that I suppose are important to measure, but those are not the constraints as we thought they were. They're kind of the byproduct of the constraint. And what I mean in this particular instance, I'll bring it back to the vulnerability is the injury. Because the athlete's always flirting with, finding that optimal acute to chronic training load ratio. It's like, okay, well, here's an average, but if the athlete was slightly different, and by the way, like that unit that we developed correlates very nicely with HRV, or resting heart rate, in the morning. So they're all really good indicators of the athlete's readiness for new stress, right? So the interesting thing was, though, when we looked at the athletes as a whole, keep in mind they're like in their mid-20s, so they're done their NCAA, and they've survived it, right? Because it's not as precise as professional training. And so what would, not surprisingly, is we found an overrepresentation of injury protecting alleles, right? But there was a subset of athletes who were actually quite vulnerable, who won Olympic medals. How did that happen, right? It's like, well, you had coaches who knew this about them, and so their training load would be like, in some instances, like a quarter compared to their training partners, and then they would win medals, right? So I look at that model and talking about what we're trying to do with, longevity, or just even, I think about how do I bring this into my family? And, we have, I have a daughter, we're planning for more, but, families have multiple children. And so, how do they look at those children, differently? And I'm not saying everybody should turn their child into an athlete, but what I'm saying is, like, when you go through human development, there's different things that we can bring to bear, even like in the home. And so one of the things that I like that you said was, well, part of your career was training the practitioners, with this tool set. One of the things that I learned, from my wife, whose, father had blood cancer, is you needed an advocate in the home also, right? So is there something that we also need to be doing from an education point of view for people to communicate exactly what you just said? Is like, hey, okay, yeah, you're a person out of time and out of space right now. That's really all this is. Yeah. And it's really hard to do the behavioral change to create the environment and therefore the behavior. So, and the GLP-1 thing is not a long-term solution, I don't think, but I don't want to speak out of turn on that. It may be necessary for some, but what are the long-term consequences of this approach? So what is the, I don't really expect you to answer it. It's really more of a rhetorical, but if you did have the answer, that would be cool. But how do we empower the people in the home to make this system learnable, to make biology learnable?
Yeah, that's, exactly. And I think you used the right word, empower. I think empower is really important. I like to call it agency,
Yeah.
and that, look, you're never going to get any kind of effect, outcome, beneficial outcome. Again, speaking from a physician perspective, if your patient isn't engaged, if they're not bought in, and so that's the critical component, because I say, look, I'm not going to heal you. I can't heal you. I can guide you on what you should do to heal yourself. Right. So I can say, maybe you want to eat this type of diet. It's up to them to do that. Right. I'm not going to come over and spoon, every bite you take into your mouth. So it's really about empowerment. And what I've seen really across the board is that empowerment starts with education. So it starts with understanding that, oh my gosh, I can actually do something about it. People often see disease as this inevitable thing that's going to happen to them, and they don't, it suddenly hits them, and wow, they got this disease, when really, and a good example is, diabetes. Okay, diabetes, or this idea of insulin resistance, is usually takes decades to develop, right? Starts subtle and small, and then it continues to develop and develop. And then suddenly, you go to your doctor, you get a blood test, and you've hit that magic number of your glucose or hemoglobin A1C. And now you've got this diagnosis of diabetes. And people come and say, oh my gosh, I just caught diabetes, right? No, that's been developing for 20 years or more. And so, yes, now that offers an opportunity to go in and look anywhere along that continuum. You can go in and prevent this, right? And start to reverse it. But it starts with agency, that you understand that you have control of your biology. Too much in medicine, we've tried to just say, now the doctor's going to control it, whatever is going to happen to you, and then don't worry, the doctor's going to figure it out, right? But we don't, across our culture, really say you're an active participant in what happens to you, in how you optimize your life. Athletes get it, I think, because they understand that what they do is important, but the majority of people are not athletes, right? And so that's going to happen. You mentioned Tom Brady. What he does is going to be different now that he's not playing than when he was, right? We know that there's so many things that change as we get older, and we look at them as something that's bad. We always say, oh, loss of muscle mass is bad. As we get older, it happens. Well, read a paper this morning, actually, that shows that is an adaptive response that creates resiliency. If you stimulate mTOR, which is the protein complex that stimulates muscle growth, we know that in longevity, the only things that have really shown to extend lifespan, things like calorie restriction, rapamycin, those things actually inhibit mTOR. They inhibit the growth of muscles. So this idea of retaining muscle stem cell capability of regeneration and resiliency is opposite to building big muscles when you're 50, 60, or let's say 80 years old, right? So there's, the timing matters, and we can't look at everything that our body does as negative, right? Our body is wise, it's smart. And we need to start understanding, why does that happen as we get older? Why would our body respond that way to that type of environment? There's usually a reason behind it. And so that kind of ties back to this idea of empowerment and agency, and people starting to trust themselves, right? Trust their bodies, if there's one thing that I could teach the most to people, is to learn to trust themselves. is, I say this to mothers who are about to have babies. It's like, everybody in the world is going to tell you what you need to do to raise that baby. Trust your mother heart. That's going to be the right answer, right? Everybody is going to, and food, everybody has something. You've got to eat more protein. You've got to eat this. You got to follow the Mediterranean diet. You have to do this. I can tell you that if you trust your intuition and go, how do you feel when you eat it? Is this making me feel better or worse? You're going to know exactly what to eat, right? I use that. It's a great example. Mark David talks about, just to illustrate this. He talks about it in his book, The Slowdown Diet. But this idea that one of his clients used to go to McDonald's every day and eat a Big Mac, and he wanted to lose weight. So he goes to see Mark, and he says, I want you to help me lose weight, but I don't want you to take away my Big Mac. I love my Big Mac, and I'm going to go there every day. So he said, okay, we'll work with this. What I want you to do, instead of going through the drive-through, taking the Big Mac and eating it in the car on the way back to work, I want you to go into the restaurant and spend 15 minutes and enjoy every single bite of that Big Mac. So the guy said, fine, I can do that. He comes back, whatever number of weeks later, and says, do you know what? I hate Big Macs. So this concept that if you actually pay attention, if you actually listen to the signals that your body sends you, you're going to make the right decisions. And that's that's the agency, the empowerment that we're talking about. So if we can teach our children anything, it's teach them to trust themselves. There's a great book called The Continuum Concept, where she looks at how they raise children in I think it was an Amazon tribe, that's kind of separate from civilization. And they don't do anything to protect their children. They let them play with sharp knives. They let them play on the edge of pits. They let them and there's no injuries. The kids don't kill themselves, right? Because they teach the children to trust. Like, human nature is one of survival. We're not going to kill ourselves if we trust that. And children are born with that survival instinct. And so, anyway, this is a long way of saying that really that understanding that you have the power, you are empowered, you have agency. If we can teach people that, then we can get this out to everybody, and they'll understand that.
Amazing. I want to just echo some of these things back to make sure that the listeners really appreciate at least some of the things that I understood. And then I want to be respectful of your time, because I could be here for 3 hours, and I definitely would want to have you back and pick on some of these really kind of foundational ideas that you're bringing to the front here. First on, just kind of the Tom Brady thread there and mTOR. It's like, how he wants mTOR behave while he's in his career versus after his career, totally different. And so there's performance longevity, and then there's longevity of health span. Yeah. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. And that comes back to what we were saying, like, well, what are you adapting to and for and why and purpose? And I think that comes back to the agency piece. And, timely, I was listening to a piece, it was Steve Young, another NFLer. He was talking about kind of at a point in his career where he's just getting started, and he happened to meet Stephen Covey on the plane, who wrote the book 7 Habits. And Stephen Covey's point is like, it's the hardest one that I thought I learned, but I keep coming back to is, I dropped the ball again. And that's like to be proactive, which is the agency, right? Yeah. So, and it's a hard one, right? Because when you're a child, I think things are done, let's say, to and for you, but then at a certain point, you're doing things to and for yourself, if you have any kind of personal responsibility, if you've been able to get to that point. And then if that's true, basically what you're saying is, well, there's a part of this whole that it's hard to admit, but you've dug it. And the good news is that you know that now. And I think like that really, I love the stuff that you're saying around the biology here is like, it's not determined. Even your genetics is not going to determine you, because you can, with help, create the environment to bring about that performance. Absolutely. And we know that that's possible because the athletes do it. Okay, well, not everybody wants to be an athlete, but there is this like beauty, and it's what I learned from my coaches, to echo your sentiment about women who are about to go through the pregnancy and birthing processes. My coach said to me as an athlete, you are, number one, we're all wearing different bodies. Number two, you're an expert in your own body. And that seems like a big responsibility, but it's like, it's hard, but it's true. But then you can just, the experts such as yourself and, with all of this emergent technology where you can start to have a conversation with your biology and learn where you are on that continuum concept that you brought up. And even the notion of like the Big Macs thing. What I love about that is it's like, it's doing something, right? It's a job to be done. Why was that client eating the Big Mac, right? Well, he was eating it in his car. It's like, in the job to be done idea was, a Harvard Business School review idea that came off of the McDonald's milkshake, right? Where the job to be done for the milkshake buyers, or the most abundant milkshake buyers, were people who skipped breakfast and were on their way to work and wanted some form of entertainment in the car. And that's why, remember, they were like super thick milkshakes, and they would like kind of pull the roof of your mouth off, when you're a kid, right? Because they weren't made for kids. They were made for people to skip breakfast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I suspect that, with this client who was like, I got to lose this weight, probably what he hated was that drive of rushing from A to B. And what he probably hated was the stress on his life, right? Mm-hmm. And the Big Mac was doing something to soothe that. But then when he was reappropriated as another, it wasn't doing the same job. So anyway, it's just so, delightful to, speak to you on, your paradigm of medicine. I think if more doctors could be empowered with this, I think people could feel empowered with their biology. So I'm really excited for the work that I see unfolding in the field, and what you're going to do with BioScope. And so I promised you 3 questions at the beginning, which was, number one is, and I think we kind of got to the idea, but I'd love to hear you, really kind of hit it on the nose here. So if we were going to leave people with one thing, what is it? Number 2, who needs to hear it? And then number 3 is, who would you recommend as my next guest? And, sorry, I kind of led you to an answer that I think was something like, you have agency, but maybe there's another idea there, but anyway, over to you.
I mean, I think that's what I would say is, like, if there's something I want people to understand is, yes, you do have agency. We're at a point where your body's not a mystery, where we are able to see inside it. It's not this black box. You can feel it, but we also have tools to actually see what's going on. I want them to know that, take that agency and look at things early, right? We have the ability to prevent. We don't have to just wait. We don't have to wait for the medical system to do stuff to us, right? We can understand that. I think it's really important for people to understand that mind and body aren't separate. They're completely connected. They're the same. So stress and even outlook, even the thoughts we think. That's why we know meditation has such a big effect on, epigenetic expression and overall health. So I think that's really important. So think of the system that's completely connected. There's no part that's not connected to many, many other parts. So it's almost like this holographic idea that everything's connected to everything, and that you have agency about it. And it's really the only person that's going to be able to do anything about it is you. And so I think that should be, rather than a message of fear, oh my God, now what do I have to do? It should be total hope that, wow, I can do this. And trust yourself. I think that's really where I would leave it, is really trust yourself. So, I think, what was your other question? Who needs to hear this? Yeah. Like the people that feel unempowered, the people that feel like they're victims, they need to know that they're not. They need to know that we have the tools, we have the ability, and they have the ability to actually get things right. To do something about it, let's say. So, the guys that have been told they feel like crap, and they go to their doctor and everything comes back normal, like we talked about, and they're told it's all in their head. It's not, right? We can find out what's going on, and they have the ability to change it.
Amazing. And the last question, who would you recommend, who would you nominate as the next guest?
Now, I don't know. I didn't check who you had on already before, but you mentioned ISB, you mentioned systems biology. I was going to mention Nathan Price. I don't know if you know Dr. Nathan Price. He's a good friend of mine. He's worked at Systems, ISB with Lee Hood. He was Lee Hood's co-PI, and still is, I think. And really, he and Lee developed the whole concept of scientific wellness, right? Instead of saying, what's disease, they're looking at what is wellness. And I think that's the exact right way to approach it and using these deep, data sets, these personalized data clouds. I think that approach is something that I've adopted, and I really appreciate all of the work they've done and Nathan and Lee Hood to really bring that to people and our understanding of that. So anyway, I can introduce you if he's not already been on.
You know what? Nathan was my first ever guest.
Yeah.
And I've had him on twice, and I've had Lee on. And actually, this is something we can chat about offline. I'm going to work to build more of a docu-series so that people kind of outside of the scientific community can start to know about the great work that they've done, that you're doing. So I challenge you to recommend one more. Since I've had Nate, I will have him on a third time.
I had him on a third time, but we need another person to probably so. So if you want someone in the technical side of how to bring the AI and how to think about AI in medicine might be something interesting. I'll nominate someone. His name is Chris Hemp. He's our actually current, I've worked with him as a CTO in the past, and he's really in the AI and how do you apply AI in medicine?
Chris Hemp. He's not at BioScope, is he?
No.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I would welcome the challenge to host Chris Hemp. Wonderful. Okay. Well, listen, Dr. Messier, this has been an absolute privilege to spend this time with you. And, I thank you for everything you've done, you're doing, and you will do. And thank you for joining me today on the DNA of Things.
It's been a lot of fun, Jeremy. Thank you.
We've traveled today from the Northwest Territories to the cutting edge of BioScope.ai, tracing an arc from reactive management to proactive empowerment. Dr. Messier's story reminds us that our bodies are not mysteries to be feared, but wise systems waiting to be understood. She moved from the frustration of a $30 per visit constraint to building a global platform that democratizes precision medicine. Now, the question turns to us all. Where are we on our own health continuum? Will we continue to wait for the system to catch our disease, or will we step into our next chapter and trust the signals of our bodies and leverage these emergent technologies being spearheaded by people like Dr. Helen Messier and the folks at BioScope.ai?